Have you ever felt, deep down in your soul, that you didn't belong to the place where you were born? As if the life you are leading is a geographic error, or the lingering trace of a past that isn't truly yours? Imagine for a second the cruelest scenario. You wake up every day in a cold room, put on worn-out clothes, and when you arrive at school or work, what awaits you isn't respect, but the look of contempt from those who think they are superior. Imagine being the constant target of muffled laughter in the hallways of public humiliations. That burn your face and make your heart race with shame. Now, hold that image of pain and suffering and watch it transform completely. Imagine that same person, months later, stepping out of a bulletproof black limousine under the flash of cameras, dressed in silk and carrying the gaze of authority, the gaze of someone who didn't just survive, but conquered the world. What if your greatest nightmare actually hid the secret of your true identity? Stay with me until the very end, because what you are about to discover might surprise you in ways you never imagined. We are about to dive into the journey of Maya, a young girl who hit rock bottom before discovering she was the sole heiress to the wealthiest family in the country. But this isn't just a story about he who laughs last, laughs best. It is a deep dive into the sub-niche of drama and the phenomenon of mistaken identity, where every detail of the past is a piece of a dangerous, billion-dollar puzzle. Maya grew up in a humble orphanage, surrounded by peeling walls and empty promises. To her, the word family was an abstract concept, something she only saw in TV commercials or in the social media photos of the girls who made her life a living hell. Have you ever gone through something like this? The feeling of being invisible, or worse, being seen only as a target. Maya's life was marked by scarcity. But what hurt the most wasn't the hunger or the cold. It was the relentless bullying. Her tormentors had no idea that behind that silent orphan girl lay a secret that would make their empires crumble like a deck of cards. Fate is ironic, and sometimes it loves to play with those who feel untouchable. While she scrubbed floors and listened to insults about her unknown origins, the clock was ticking. Lawyers in luxury offices at the top of skyscrapers were moving mountains of paperwork in search of one person, the long-lost heiress of a lineage that dates back to the very roots of the country's elite. Mistaken identity isn't just a fictional trope. It's a reflection of how life can take turns so sharp they leave you breathless. Imagine the strength required to endure the weight of the world without knowing that you are, in fact, the owner of it. Maya had nothing except a small silver locket she had kept. Since she was a baby, her only link to a past shrouded in mist. That worn piece of jewelry was the key to a mystery that many powerful people wanted to keep buried. Why was she left behind? Who profited from her disappearance? These questions began to find answers in explosive ways, turning her routine of humiliation into a battlefield for justice and recognition. The contrast is jarring. Seeing someone who was trampled upon rise up with the crown that always belonged to them touches something very powerful within all of us. It is the classic modern Cinderella, but with a layer of psychological drama and power intrigue that makes it all feel much more real and urgent. Prepare your heart, because Maya's transition from a broken girl to the most influential woman in the nation wasn't just a matter of luck. It was a reckoning with the universe. But before we get to the glitter of jewels and absolute power, we need to understand how the first thread of this web began to be pulled, and how a simple chance encounter revealed that nothing in Maya's life was what it seemed to be. Everything changed on a Tuesday afternoon, a day that started just as bleakly as any other. Maya was kneeling on the cold tiles of the hallway, scrubbing away the muddy footprints left behind by those who never even looked her in the eye. That was when she saw them, 3 men in sharp, charcoal gray suits, their polished shoes reflecting the fluorescent lights in a way that felt entirely out of place. In such a gray building, they weren't looking for a teacher or the director. They were looking for her. When they finally stood before her, they didn't offer a sneer or a command. Instead, they offered a bow, a gesture of respect that felt like a glitch in the matrix of her reality. They spoke of a name she had only seen in history books and on the facades of the city's grandest foundations. They spoke of her lineage. It's moments like these that make us question the very fabric of our lives. Have you ever stood at a crossroads, waiting for a sign that things would finally get better? Perhaps you felt that same spark of hope or felt the sting of being undervalued. If this story is resonating with you right now, I'd love for you to take a quick second to leave a comment below and share what's going through your mind. Maybe you've experienced your own turning point, or perhaps you just know how it feels to be the underdog. Your participation is truly what breathes life into this channel. When you share your thoughts, it builds a community of empathy that helps these stories reach so many others who might need to hear them today. While you're down there, please hit the like button and subscribe to join our family here. It might seem like a small click to you, but for us, it's a powerful signal that tells the world this content matters. It's the fuel that allows me to keep digging for these incredible stories of transformation and justice. By subscribing, you're making sure you won't miss a single step of Maya's evolution. Because believe me, the path from the orphanage floor to the boardroom of a global empire is paved with obstacles that would break a lesser soul. As the lead attorney opened a leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, each one bearing the golden seal of the most powerful estate in the country. Maya felt the world tilting. The silver locket around her neck, once a symbol of her abandonment, suddenly felt heavy with the weight of generations. One of the men leaned in, his voice a low, respectful murmur, and whispered the words that would officially end Maya's life as a victim and begin her reign as a queen. But as the realization of her new power started to sink in, so did the chilling awareness that being a billionaire isn't just about the wealth, it's about the target it places on your back. And as Maya looked toward the exit, she realized that the people who had spent years trying to break her were now the very ones she would have to face from a position of absolute power. The transition from the cold floor to the polished world of the elite didn't happen in a vacuum. It began in the grueling silence of Maya's daily survival. To truly understand the magnitude of her transformation, we have to look closely at the shadows she inhabited, a place where her mental fortitude was forged. In the fire of constant adversity, Maya's routine was a masterclass in invisibility. Every morning, long before the sun had even thought about rising, she was awake. The orphanage was a place of echoes and thin blankets, where the air always smelled of damp wood and old laundry detergent. Her morning ritual wasn't about choosing an outfit or planning a career. It was about bracing herself. She would look into a cracked mirror, seeing a face that the world had tried its best to ignore, and she would whisper to herself that she was enough. This wasn't just a habit. It was a survival strategy, a way to protect her spirit before the world tried to tear it down. As she walked to the local public school, the weight of her reality felt like a physical burden. Maya didn't have the luxury of new sneakers or the latest gadgets that her peers flaunted like badges of honor. She wore hand-me-downs that were 3 sizes too large, held together by safety pins and sheer willpower. But the true challenge wasn't the poverty. It was the psychological warfare of the social hierarchy. In every hallway, there were predator students who looked at Maya's quiet dignity and saw a target. They didn't understand her journey, so they tried to write her story for her, labeling her with words that were meant to sting. They would accidentally trip her in the cafeteria or leave cruel notes in her locker, laughing as if her struggle was a form of entertainment. They viewed her through a lens of judgment, never realizing that the girl they were mocking carried a legacy that could buy and sell their family's businesses 100 times over. This period of her life was defined by the decision she made in the dark. The decision not to let their cruelty define her value, and the decision to keep her heart open despite the coldness surrounding her. In those moments of deep isolation, Maya found solace in the library, a sanctuary where she began to cultivate a different kind of mental strength. She read about history, about great leaders who rose from nothing, and about the hidden truths that often lie beneath the surface of the obvious. She was unknowingly preparing her mind for the impact of the revelations to come. She understood that while she couldn't control her environment, she could control her internal narrative. This wasn't just about coping. It was about building a foundation of resilience, She watched the popular girls, the ones who lived in the bastidors of luxury, protected by their parents' wealth, and she observed their behavior with a curious detachment. She saw the insecurity behind their bullying, the way they needed to push someone down just to feel tall. This insight gave her a strange kind of power. She wasn't just a victim. She was an observer of a broken system. The bullying reached a fever pitch during the annual school gala, an event Maya was forced to attend as a volunteer server. It was the ultimate test of her patience. Clad in a tattered apron, she moved between tables of people who looked right through her as if she were made of glass. One girl, the ringleader of her tormentors, intentionally spilled a glass of red punch down Maya's front, leading to a chorus of jeers that echoed through the decorated hall. For a moment, Maya felt the familiar sting of tears, the urge to run and hide in the shadows where she felt safe. But instead, she stood her ground. She wiped the liquid from her face, looked her bully in the eye, and felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of calm. It was a moment of profound transformation. She realized that their power was an illusion, built on fleeting social status, while her power was being built on something indestructible, her character. She didn't know then that the silver locket hidden beneath her stained shirt was a beacon. But she felt a shift in the atmosphere, a sense that the truth was finally starting to push its way toward the light. This wasn't just about a girl being bullied. It was about the collision of two worlds, the world of unearned privilege and the world of earned resilience. Every insult thrown her way was actually a stone being added to the fortress of her future authority. She began to realize that the journey she was on was far more complex than a simple rags to riches story. It was about the revelation of a hidden truth that had been suppressed for years by people who feared what she represented. There was a truth hidden in the archives of the city's most prestigious law firms, a truth that involved secret deals, forgotten promises, and a web of lies that stretched back to the day she was born. Maya's daily struggle was the backdrop for a much larger drama, playing out in the shadows of the nation's power structures. The people who ignored her in the streets were the same ones whose lives would soon be upended by her mere existence. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because the struggle Maya faced wasn't just about the external bullying. It was about the internal war of identity. She had to constantly fight the urge to believe the lies being told about her. This is where the real work happens, in the quiet moments where you decide who you are going to be, despite what the world says. She began to notice small things, glitches in her reality that suggested her life wasn't as random as it seemed. There were strangers who lingered too long near the orphanage, people who seemed to recognize her eyes, and a series of coincidences that felt more like a choreographed sequence of events. She started to pay attention to the details, the subtle clues left behind by a family she never knew. This was the beginning of her investigative journey, a quest to unearth the bastidors of her own origin. She realized that her life wasn't a tragedy. It was a mystery waiting to be solved. The more she leaned into her curiosity, the more she felt the weight of her untapped potential. She began to adopt a new mental state, one of quiet anticipation. She wasn't just waiting for a miracle. She was preparing herself to be the kind of person who could handle the responsibility of a massive legacy. She understood that wealth without character is a cage, but power combined with empathy is a force that can change the world. This mindset shift was the most important part of her journey. It allowed her to see the bullying not as a curse, but as a training ground. It taught her how to read people, how to spot manipulation, and how to remain calm under pressure, skills that would be vital in the shark-infested waters of high society. The girl who was once mocked for her old clothes was secretly becoming a master of strategy, a woman who could navigate any room with grace and authority. Maya's internal transformation was the true engine of her success. Even as she scrubbed floors, she was visualizing the boardroom. She wasn't just dreaming of luxury. She was calculating the impact she could have. She began to understand that her suffering had given her a unique perspective, a superpower of awareness that the wealthy and entitled completely lacked. They were blinded by their own comfort, while Maya was sharpened by her discomfort. This is the truth occulta that most people miss. Greatness is often grown in the dark, away from the applause. As the legal battle for her identity began to brew in the background, Maya was already mentally moving into her future role. She was shedding the skin of a victim and stepping into the shoes of a leader. One decision at a time. As the days turned into weeks, the atmosphere around Maya became increasingly charged. The orphanage directors seemed nervous. The mail started arriving in thick, expensive envelopes, and the lawyers who would eventually change her life were already beginning to close in. The shadows she had lived in for so long were starting to retreat, replaced by the blinding light of a new reality. She was standing on the precipice of a life she couldn't even imagine, a life where every decision she made would have a global impact. The transition was coming, and it would be more explosive than anyone, including Maya herself, could have ever predicted. The truth was no longer a distant whisper. It was a roar that was about to shatter the silence of her world. The bullies, the poverty, and the isolation were about to become mere footnotes in the biography of a legend. Write down, I'm on this journey too. The shift began not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet sound of a silver chain snapping. It was a Tuesday, a day heavy with the scent of rain and the usual exhaustion that follows a long shift. In the orphanage laundry room, Maya was leaning over a basin when the locket she had worn since infancy caught on the edge of the metal. As the link gave way, the small, tarnished silver heart fell onto the wet floor, clicking open for the first time in 18 years. Inside wasn't a photo, but a micro-engraving, a crest so intricate it looked like a fingerprint of the elite. To anyone else, it might have been just a pretty design. But to a girl who had spent years studying history in the quiet corners of the library, it looked like a key to a vault she wasn't supposed to know existed. This was the first crack in the wall of her reality, a tiny revelation that suggested her life wasn't just a series of unfortunate events, but a carefully guarded secret. That very afternoon, a black sedan parked at the curb, and a man stepped out whose presence seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. This was Arthur Vance, a high-stakes litigator known for navigating the treacherous bastidors of the country's most powerful families. He wasn't there for an inspection or a donation. He was there because of a digital facial recognition match from a CCTV feed at the school gala, a match that pointed directly to a girl who was supposed to have vanished nearly 2 decades ago. When he saw Maya standing in the hallway, clutching her broken locket, the color drained from his face. He didn't see an orphan in a stained apron. He saw the lost heiress of the Valmont dynasty, a girl whose absence had left a multi-billion-dollar empire in a state of frozen tension. The physical resemblance wasn't just striking, it was undeniable. It was the kind of truth that doesn't just change a life, but reshapes the entire landscape of a nation's economy. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because the moment Arthur Vance spoke her name, Maya's mental state underwent a profound transformation. He didn't call her Maya. He used a name that sounded like velvet and steel, a name that carried the weight of history and the promise of absolute authority. In that instant, the decision she had made to survive the resilience she had built while being mocked by her peers suddenly became her greatest assets. She realized that the bullying she had endured was actually a masterclass in reading human nature, a skill she would now need to navigate the shark-infested waters of her new reality. This wasn't just about inheriting money. It was about reclaiming a legacy that had been stolen by those who thrived on deceit. The incident in Satani had finally occurred, breaking the cycle of her suffering and replacing it with a journey into the heart of power. An intrigue. Vance handed her a file, and as Maya flipped through the pages, she saw the bastidors of a conspiracy. There were birth certificates with redacted names, blurred photographs of a woman who looked exactly like her, and a series of legal maneuvers designed to keep her hidden in the shadows forever. The impact of these revelations was staggering. She began to see that her life had been a series of calculated moves by individuals who feared the day she would finally wake up. This wasn't just a story of a long-lost daughter. It was a battle for the soul of an empire. Maya's mindset shifted from survival to strategy. She realized that every person who had ever looked down on her was about to face a reckoning they couldn't possibly imagine. Her presence in that office, sitting across from the most powerful lawyer in the city, was a declaration of war against the status quo. But as the excitement of the discovery began to settle, a darker truth began to emerge. If she was indeed the sole heir to the Valmont fortune, then her disappearance hadn't been an accident. It had been an assassination attempt that failed. This realization sent a chill through her veins that no orphanage winter could ever match. She was no longer just an orphan. She was a target with a price on her head that surpassed the GDP of some small countries. The journey ahead wasn't just about stepping into a mansion. It was about surviving the people who were currently living in it. She had to learn the rules of a game she didn't even know she was playing. And she had to do it faster than her enemies could find her. The silver locket wasn't just a memento. It was a beacon for those who wanted her dead, and a symbol of hope for those who had been waiting for her return. The atmosphere in the room shifted as Vance explained the legal hurdles ahead. To claim her identity, Maya would have to undergo a series of biometric tests and face a tribunal of the Valmont board, members of the very people who had benefited from her absence. This was where her transformation would be tested. She couldn't walk into the boardroom as the girl who was tripped in the cafeteria. She had to walk in as the woman who owned the room. She began to analyze her past experiences with a new lens, realizing that her ability to stay calm under the pressure of bullying was the exact mental state required for high-level negotiations. Every scar, every insult, and every moment of isolation had been preparing her for this impact. She was no longer a victim of her circumstances. She was the architect of her destiny. As they spoke, a realization dawned on Maya. The truth she was seeking was buried under layers of corporate espionage and family betrayal. The person who had left her at the orphanage wasn't just a stranger. It was someone who knew her intimately. This was the hidden truth that the documents couldn't tell her. She needed to look into the eyes of those who claimed to be her kin and see the reflection of her own past. The decision she made in the next 24 hours would determine not only her future, but the future of thousands of people whose lives were tied to the Valmont Empire. She was standing at the threshold of a new world, a world of unimaginable luxury and lethal danger. The simple routine of her old life was gone forever, replaced by the relentless pace of a high-stakes drama that was only just beginning. The transformation was becoming physical. As she stood up to leave with Vance, her posture changed. The slouch of a girl trying to hide was replaced by the straight back of a woman who was ready to lead. She looked at the orphanage one last time, not with sadness, but with a strange kind of gratitude. It had been the force that made her unbreakable. As they walked toward the car, she noticed the same girls who had mocked her only hours before staring from a window, their faces twisted with confusion and envy. They didn't understand the journey she was on, and they never would. Maya was leaving the shadows behind and stepping into a light so bright it would expose every secret her family had ever tried to hide. The game had changed, and for the first time in her life, Maya held all the cards, every detail in the locket, every word in the file, and every glance from the lawyer pointed toward a single, undeniable conclusion. The girl who had nothing was actually the girl who had everything. But wealth is a heavy crown to wear, and Maya was about to find out exactly how much it cost. The bastadors of the elite were waiting for her, and she was walking into them with her eyes wide open. This was more than a revelation. It was a rebirth. And as the car pulled away, leaving the gray walls of her past behind, Maya realized that the hardest part of her journey wasn't finding out who she was, it was deciding what she was going to do about it. The world was about to feel the impact of a woman who had nothing left to lose, and an entire empire to gain. Comment below. This makes sense to me. The leather interior of the car smelled of expensive cedar and silent secrets, a stark contrast to the lingering scent of bleach that had defined Maya's existence for nearly 2 decades. As the orphanage faded in the rearview mirror, a new, more suffocating weight began to settle in her chest, not the weight of poverty, but the crushing gravity of a mystery that defied logic. Arthur Vance sat beside her, his silence as heavy as the stack of legal documents between them. The question wasn't just about who she was, but about who had been occupying her space in the world. If Maya was the true heiress, then who was the girl currently appearing in society magazines, smiling at charity galas, and living in the Valmont mansion? This was the true core of the conflict, a web of stolen identity that went far deeper than a simple case of a lost child. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. There was an imposter. Someone had meticulously stepped into the vacuum left by her disappearance, wearing her name like a stolen coat. This wasn't a mere coincidence or a clerical error. It was a high-stakes performance enacted at the highest levels of the nation's elite. Maya felt a wave of dizziness as she contemplated the mental state of those involved. How many people were in on the lie? Her parents were gone, but surely someone, an aunt, a grandfather, a family friend would have noticed the difference. This meant the conspiracy wasn't just about money. It was about a total erasure of her existence. She began to feel a strange, agonizing sense of vertigo. She was the real Maya, yet the world already had a Maya. In the eyes of the law, the banks, and the public, she was the ghost, and the girl in the mansion was the reality. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because this is where the psychological impact of the journey truly takes hold. For 18 years, Maya had been told she was nobody. Now, she was being told she was the most important person in the country, but that herself had already been claimed. It creates a paralyzing internal war, the imposter syndrome in its most literal, terrifying form. Even as she held the silver locket, a voice in the back of her mind whispered that perhaps she was the mistake. What if the lab tests came back negative? What if this was all a cruel prank or a different kind of trap? The desire to reclaim her life was constantly battling the fear of being exposed as a fraud, even though she was the one who had been defrauded. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight for the right to exist in her own skin. She looked at the photographs Vance provided, images of the girl known to the world as Isabella Valmont. The resemblance was haunting, the kind of similarity that could only be achieved through careful selection, or perhaps even surgical intervention. This Isabella moved with a practiced grace, her smile hitting all the right notes of regal warmth. She was exactly what the public expected an heiress to be. Maya, on the other hand, was raw, sharpened by the bastidors of survival. Her hands calloused and her gaze guarded. She felt like a jagged piece of glass trying to fit into a frame made for a diamond. The mental fortitude required to face this wasn't just about courage. It was about a complete transformation of her self-image. She had to stop seeing herself as the girl who didn't belong, and start seeing herself as the rightful owner of a legacy that had been hijacked. The why of it all began to gnaw at her. Why was she left at that orphanage? If Isabella was the replacement, then Maya's survival was the ultimate threat to a very lucrative lie. Every decision made by the Valmont board over the last decade had been based on the legitimacy of the girl currently in the mansion. If the truth came out, billions of dollars in investments, contracts, and political alliances would vanish overnight. The revelation wouldn't just be a family reunion. It would be a financial apocalypse. This was the hidden truth that kept Arthur Vance's face so grim. He knew that by bringing Maya back, he wasn't just correcting a wrong. He was pulling the pin on a grenade. The bastidors of the elite are built on stability, and Maya was the personification of chaos. She began to wonder about her parents' final moments. The accidental crash that took their lives now felt like a calculated move on a chessboard. She was only just beginning to see. Was she supposed to have died with them? Or was her abandonment at the orphanage a desperate act of mercy by someone who couldn't bring themselves to kill a child, but needed her gone? The complexity of the conspiracy suggested that the decisions leading to her current situation were made by someone with a terrifying level of impact. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a corporate strategy. And Isabella, was she a victim too? A puppet raised to play a part? Or was she a willing participant in the theft of a life? The psychological tension of facing her double was becoming a central theme of her new reality. As the car wound through the wealthy suburbs, the house is getting larger and the gates more imposing. Maya felt the walls of her new identity closing in. She was entering a world where every smile was a mask and every word was a maneuver. Her journey from the orphanage was almost complete, but her journey into the truth was just beginning. She realized that to win, she would have to become a version of herself she didn't yet recognize. She would have to learn to hide her emotions, to speak in the coded language of power, and to navigate the treacherous social bastidors where one wrong move could be fatal. She was no longer just fighting for a bank account. She was fighting to reclaim her name from a shadow that had been living her life. The contrast between her internal turmoil and the external luxury was almost too much to bear. She sat in a room designed for comfort, surrounded by original artwork and hand-woven rugs. Yet she felt more exposed than she ever had on the orphanage floor. In the orphanage, the enemies were obvious. They were the bullies with loud voices and quick fists. Here, the enemies were silent. They were the people who would shake her hand while calculating how to bury her again. This realization was the final step in her mental shift. She couldn't afford to be the girl seeking a family. She had to be the queen reclaiming a throne. The Isabella she saw in the magazines wasn't a sister or a cousin. She was a barricade. Maya realized that the truth occult to the hidden truth wasn't just about her birthright. It was about the fact that she was the only one who could see the rot at the heart of the Valmont Empire. Having lived on the outside, she saw the world with a clarity that those on the inside had long since lost. Her perspective was her weapon. Every hardship she had faced, every night she had spent wondering who she was, had given her a level of resilience that Isabella, raised in silk and honey, could never comprehend. The imposter had the name and the jewelry, but Maya had the fire. The collision between the two was inevitable, and the impact would change the country forever. As she prepared for the first formal meeting with the estate's executors, Maya looked at her reflection. The clothes Vance had provided were exquisite, but the person underneath was still the girl who knew how to fight. She wasn't an imposter. She was the reckoning. The fear of being a fraud began to dissolve, replaced by a cold, sharp certainty. She didn't need to find herself. She needed to take back what was hers. The mystery of why she was left behind was the fuel for her fire, and she wouldn't whisper to herself that she would not stop until every person involved in the theft of her life was brought to justice. The identity crisis was over. The war for the truth had begun. Write down. This makes sense to me. The sleep, clinical silence of the private laboratory felt like a sensory vacuum after the chaotic noise of Maya's past. There were no shouts from bullies here. No rattling of orphanage pipes, only the low hum of high-end machinery, and the rhythmic ticking of a clock that seemed to be counting down the final seconds of her old life. Standing there, Maya felt the weight of the entire Valmont legacy pressing against her shoulders. This was the point of no return. The genetic sample had been taken, the sequence had been mapped, and now, the digital divide between a nameless orphan and a global titan was about to be crossed. Arthur Vance stood near the window, his expression unreadable, though his fingers tapped a restless rhythm on his leather briefcase. He knew better than anyone that what was about to happen wasn't just a medical formality. It was a seismic shift in the nation's power structure. The tension in the room was so thick it felt tangible, a shared breath held by everyone who knew the stakes of this revelation. When the lead technician finally approached, he wasn't carrying just a piece of paper. He was carrying the verdict of a decade-long mystery. He placed a sealed envelope on the mahogany table with a level of reverence usually reserved for ancient artifacts. Maya stared at it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. In that moment, her mental state was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She thought of the cold mornings, the hand-me-down clothes, and the girl in the magazines who had been living her life. She realized that the truth occult to the hidden truth contained within the white envelope would act as a detonator. If the numbers matched, the transformation would be absolute. The orphan would vanish, and the heiress would be born in the eyes of the law. But if they didn't, the impact would be a total collapse into a darkness she might never escape. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because the psychological journey of waiting for a DNA result is unlike any other form of suspense. It is the ultimate confrontation with reality. Maya wasn't just waiting for a confirmation of wealth. She was waiting for a confirmation of her own existence. For 18 years, her identity had been a question mark, a series of blank spaces filled in by the cruelty of others. This document was the first thing in her life that promised an objective, unalterable truth. She looked at Vance, searching for a sign of doubt, but the lawyer remained a pillar of professional stone. He had seen the bastidors of this investigation. He knew the risks they were taking by challenging the current Valmont heiress. The decisions made in this sterile room would ripple out into the stock market, the headlines, and the very foundations of high society. With a hand that trembled only slightly, Maya reached out and broke the seal. The sound of the paper tearing felt as loud as a gunshot in the quiet office. As she pulled the document out, the technical jargon and complex percentages blurred for a second before her eyes locked onto a single, bolded phrase at the bottom of the page. The statistical probability of paternity was not just high, it was undeniable. It was a 99.9% match. The air seemed to rush back into the room all at once. Maya felt a wave of heat wash over her, followed by a chilling clarity. It was true. Everything she had suspected, everything the locket had hinted at, was now a matter of scientific fact. She wasn't an imposter. She was the missing piece of a billion-dollar puzzle. But as the initial shock faded, the deeper implications of the results began to settle in. What the documents revealed would change more than just her bank account. It would dictate the destiny of an incalculable fortune and expose a conspiracy that had successfully deceived the world for 18 years. This was the moment the game truly changed. The Isabella currently sitting in the Valmont mansion was now, officially, a fraud. The board members who had supported her, the lawyers who had validated her, and the family members who had embraced her were all suddenly standing on a foundation of lies that Maya now had the power to demolish. This revelation was a weapon, and for the first time in her life, Maya was the one holding the trigger. She looked at the graphs on the report, seeing the biological map of her lineage. She saw the markers of her father's strength and her mother's resilience, written in the code of her own blood. It was a profound moment of connection, a bridge built across a chasm of lost years. However, this joy was quickly shadowed by a new, more dangerous reality. The impact of this paper meant that Maya was no longer just a secret. She was a threat. The people who had installed a fake heiress wouldn't just step aside because of a lab report. They had everything to lose: their status, their freedom, and their wealth. The transition from the laboratory to the boardroom was going to be a journey through a literal minefield. Maya had to adopt a new mentality, one that wasn't just about reclaiming what was hers, but about surviving the counterattack that was surely coming. Vance leaned in, his voice a low, urgent whisper as he looked at the confirmed results. He explained that from the second forward, Maya's life would never be private again. She was now the center of a geopolitical and financial storm. The bastidors of the Valmont Empire were already beginning to churn as news of the test leaked to key stakeholders. Decisions that had been made years ago were being frantically reevaluated in darkened offices across the city. Maya realized that the truth she held in her hand was a double-edged sword. It gave her the throne, but it also made her the most hunted woman in the country. The mystery of how she ended up in the orphanage was no longer a sad story. It was a criminal investigation that would lead to the very top of the social ladder. The mindset she had cultivated in the orphanage, the ability to observe, to wait, and to endure, was now her greatest strategic advantage. While the elite were panicking, Maya remained calm. She had already lived through the worst the world could throw at her. She had been hungry, cold, and humiliated. What could these people in their silk suits do to her that hadn't already been done? This lack of fear was her secret power. She looked at the DNA report one last time before tucking it into her own briefcase. She was ready. The transformation of her identity was complete on paper. Now, it had to be completed in the world. As they prepared to leave the lab and head toward the Valmont headquarters for the final confrontation, Maya felt a strange sense of peace. The girl who scrubbed floors was gone, replaced by a woman who understood the true weight of her name. The impact of her return would be felt for generations. A story of justice that would finally be told in full. But as the car doors closed, shielding her from the outside world, she knew that the hardest part of the journey was still ahead. The board was waiting, the imposter was waiting, and the truth was finally ready to be shouted from the rooftops. The destiny of the Valmont fortune was now in her hands, and she wasn't going to let it go without a fight. The car began to move, navigating through the city streets that Maya used to walk in worn-out shoes. Now, she looked out the tinted windows as a ruler returning to her kingdom. She thought about the people who had wronged her, the people who had ignored her, and the one person who was currently living her life in the Valmont estate. The reckoning was no longer a dream. It was an appointment on her calendar. She was no longer Maya the orphan. She was the heir to everything, and she was coming to collect. The silence of the car was a prelude to the explosion that was about to occur in the heart of the city's power structure. The world was about to find out that some secrets are too big to stay buried, and some legacies are too strong to be stolen. Comment below. This makes sense to me. The moment the DNA confirmation was officially read aloud, in the presence of the Valmont estate's primary executors, the air in the room didn't suddenly fill with the sound of trumpets or the warmth of a fairy tale ending. Instead, it became heavy with a chilling, clinical silence. Maya sat there, the scientific proof of her identity resting on the table like a live wire, and she felt a wave of absolute, paralyzing shock. It wasn't the kind of shock that makes you want to jump for joy. It was a profound, bone-deep realization that her entire life of suffering had been a lie. Every night she spent shivering under thin blankets, every insult she took from a bully, and every day she spent scrubbing floors believing she was a nobody, was the result of a deliberate erasure. The confirmation wasn't just a golden ticket. It was a devastating revelation that her hardship wasn't an accident of fate, but a byproduct of a dark, calculated decision made in the bastidors of power. She realized that she wasn't just found, she had been stolen, and the weight of those lost 18 years began to press down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. This wasn't a moment of winning in the traditional sense. It was the moment Maya looked back at the girl who was tripped in the cafeteria and realized that girl never had to exist. The mental toll of knowing that her trauma was a currency used by others to maintain their luxury was staggering. She looked at Arthur Vance, then at the granite-faced executors, and she didn't see people welcoming her home. She saw the witnesses to a massive, systemic crime. The transformation she was undergoing at that second was more than just a change in social status. It was a total collapse of her former reality. The truth she had chased was now a jagged glass she had to hold in her bare hands. She began to process the impact of this betrayal, realizing that while she was being punished by the world for being an orphan, someone else was intentionally keeping her in that cage to protect an empire. It wasn't just a mistake. It was an ambush of the past that had lasted nearly 2 decades. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because the emotional aftermath of such a revelation is where the real drama lies. Most people imagine that wealth cures all wounds, but for Maya, the money was secondary to the crushing sense of injustice. She started to question the very fabric of human nature. If she was a Valmont, then the people who left her at the orphanage knew exactly who she was. They chose to let a child grow up in scarcity and fear. This wasn't just about a lost inheritance. It was about a stolen childhood. The mental state required to absorb this is immense. Maya had to reconcile the image of herself as a resilient survivor with the new reality of being a victim of a high-level conspiracy. She felt a strange kind of mourning for the life. She should have had the birthdays she never celebrated, the parents she never got to know, and the security that was her birthright. The journey of her life had been diverted into a dark tunnel by people who valued profit over a human soul. The revelation also brought a sharp, focused anger. It was a cold, calculated fury that began to replace the initial shock. As she looked around the opulent room, she realized that every piece of art, every expensive rug, and every polished surface was part of the world that had ignored her cries. She was the rightful owner of this environment, yet she felt like an alien visitor. This is the hidden truth of the Cinderella moment. The transition is often painful, because it highlights exactly what was taken. Maya wasn't just inheriting a fortune. She was inheriting a battlefield. The decisions that led to her abandonment were likely made by people who were still in the room, or just a phone call away. The impact of her presence was like a tectonic shift, and she could see the fear beginning to flicker in the eyes of the staff and the lower-level executives. They knew that a reckoning was coming, and that the girl who had been forged in the fire of the orphanage was not going to be easily appeased by a check and a title. As the executors began to discuss the logistics of her reintegration, Maya tuned them out. Their voices sounded like white noise against the roar of her own thoughts. She was thinking about the bastidors of the crash that killed her parents. Was it a tragedy, or was it the opening act of her exile? The more she learned, the more she realized that her life was a series of revelations that would eventually lead back to a single person's greed. Her journey was no longer about finding a home. It was about dismantling the lies of those who took it from her. She had to shift her mentality from one of survival to one of absolute authority. She wasn't just a guest in this life anymore. She was the architect. The Isabella who was currently occupying the main suite was just a symptom of a much deeper rot that Maya was now uniquely qualified to cut out. She had seen the world from the bottom, and that gave her a perspective that the elite could never hope to understand. The sheer scale of the wealth she now controlled was almost impossible to grasp. It was more than just numbers on a screen. It was power over lives, over industries, and over the future of the nation. But Maya didn't feel powerful. She felt exposed. She knew that as soon as she stepped out of this room as a confirmed Valmont, every person who had ever crossed her path would try to claim a piece of her. The bullies from school would suddenly be old friends, and the enemies she didn't even know she had would be sharpening their knives. The transformation was total and irreversible. She was stepping into a world where the stakes were life and death, and where the truth was a commodity to be bought and sold. She had to decide right then and there who she was going to be. The victim, who was grateful for the crumbs, or the leader who was going to take the entire table, every detail of the orphanage life to cold. The hunger, the invisibility now served as a reminder of the debt the world owed her. Maya wasn't interested in forgiveness. She was interested in clarity. She wanted to know who signed the papers. She wanted to know who looked a baby in the eyes and decided she was better off in the shadows. This was the fire that would drive her through the next phase of her journey. She was no longer wandering in the dark. She was the one holding the torch, and she was going to burn down every lie until the foundation was clean. The impact of her return would be a seismic event in the bastidors of the high society world. A world that was about to find out that the lost heiress hadn't just been found. She had been sharpened into a weapon of truth. The atmosphere in the room remained heavy, the silence broken only by the scratching of pens on legal documents that were formalizing her rebirth. Maya looked at her hands that had scrubbed floors and carried heavy bags, and she realized they were now the hands that would sign the fate of thousands. The decisions she made from this point forward would echo through the lives of everyone in the Valmont Empire. She was the living proof that secrets have an expiration date. As she stood up to take her first step into her new life, she felt a strange sense of detachment. The girl she used to be was still there, a ghost in her own mind, reminding her of the cost of this victory. But the woman she was becoming was already moving forward, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the truth awaited. Write down, I'm on this journey too. The internal shock of the revelation began to settle into a cold, diamond-hard resolve as the physical manifestation of Maya's new life finally took flight. The transition from the gray, dampened walls of the orphanage to the gilded corridors of the Valmont estate was not just a change of scenery. It was a total reconstruction of her reality. This was the Cinderella moment the world loves to witness, but behind the scenes, it was a grueling process of shedding a skin that had been toughened by years of neglect. Maya found herself thrust into a world of high-fidelity aesthetics, where every fabric, every scent, and every color was curated to project absolute authority. The hand-me-down sweaters were replaced by bespoke tailoring that felt like armor, and the heavy boots that had stomped through city slush were swapped for heels that clicked against marble with the rhythm of a heartbeat reclaiming its throne. It was a visual transformation that stunned the bastidors of high society. But the real work was happening beneath the surface. In the quiet corridors of her mind, every morning began with a curriculum of power. Maya wasn't just learning how to walk or dress. She was being trained to manage an empire that influenced global markets. She spent hours with advisors, deconstructing the complex machinery of the Valmont holdings, learning that her new wealth was not a gift, but a massive responsibility. She had to master the art of the boardroom, understanding how to read the micro-expressions of men who had spent decades in the shadows, waiting for a chance to seize control. Her journey was now a masterclass in strategic mental state shifts. She had to learn when to be the compassionate observer she had become in the library, and when to be the unyielding force that survived the cafeteria bullies. This was the phase where she realized that her past was not a deficit, but her greatest competitive advantage. While the elite had been raised in the softness of privilege, Maya had been sharpened by the reality of the world, making her decisions more calculated and her impact far more profound. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because the true transformation wasn't about the expensive jewelry or the private jets. It was about the psychological shedding of the orphan identity. Maya had to consciously decide to stop waiting for permission to exist. In the bastidors of her training, she faced tutors who tried to mold her into a traditional socialite, a quiet figurehead who would sign papers and look pretty at galas. But Maya's mental state had been forged in a different kind of fire. She pushed back, demanding to see the ledgers, the employment contracts, and the philanthropic records. She wanted to know where the money went and whose lives it touched. This was the moment the staff realized that the lost heiress wasn't just a figure in a fairy tale. She was a leader with a vision. She began to use her authority to look into the hidden truth of how the estate had been run in her absence, spotting the inefficiencies and the quiet betrayals that had flourished while an imposter sat in her chair. The social transformation was equally jarring. Suddenly, the world that had looked through her like she was made of glass was now begging for a second of her time. Invitations arrived in mountains of embossed paper, and names she had only seen on the news were now appearing on her digital calendar. But Maya approached this with a curious detachment. She watched the people who had once ignored her now bowing with practiced smiles, and she felt a sense of clarity that only someone who has been at the bottom can possess. She understood the transactional nature of their loyalty. Her journey had taught her that the most valuable thing she owned wasn't the bank account, but her ability to see the truth occult to the truth hidden behind the polished mask of the elite. Every gala became a battlefield of information, every dinner a tactical maneuver. She was learning to play a game that Isabella had been playing her whole life, but Maya was playing it with the stakes of someone who knew exactly what it felt like to have nothing. As she stepped into her role, the physical transformation became a reflection of her internal power. Her posture changed, her voice deepened, and her gaze became a tool of interrogation. She wasn't just wearing the clothes, she was commanding them. The impact of her presence in the company headquarters was like a cold front. Moving through a summer day, it forced everyone to wake up. She started making decisions that prioritized long-term stability over short-term greed. Drawing on the resilience she had built during her years of scarcity, she understood the value of a dollar because she had lived without one, and she understood the value of dignity because she had been denied it. This phase of her training was actually a reclamation of her spirit. She was no longer a victim of a story written by others. She was the author. and she was writing a narrative of justice and excellence that the Valmont name had lacked for 20 years. The revelation of her true character began to circulate through the city's power circles, creating a ripple effect of nervous anticipation. People were starting to realize that the new Maya wasn't just a girl who got lucky. She was a force of nature who had been hidden in plain sight. She spent her nights studying the legal files Vance had provided, looking for the threads that would lead her to the people who had orchestrated her disappearance. The transformation was nearly complete. She was no longer the girl who suffered in silence. She was the woman who would make the world listen. The bastidors of the Valmont Empire were being scrubbed clean, not with soap and water this time, but with the relentless light of a truth that refused to be buried. Maya was standing at the threshold of her new kingdom, ready to face the ghosts of her past with the authority of her future. The stage was set for a collision that had been 18 years in the making. Maya had the resources, she had the legal standing, and most importantly, she had the mental fortitude to see the journey through to the end. Every decision she had made since leaving the orphanage had been a step toward this moment, the moment where the training ended and the reign began. She looked in the mirror and didn't see a Cinderella waiting for a prince. She saw a ruler who had survived the shadows and was now ready to claim the light. The impact of her return was about to move from the private offices of lawyers to the public stage of history, and the world was finally going to see the true face of the Valmont legacy. Write down, I'm on this journey too. The day finally arrived when the shadows of the past were forced to face the blinding light of the present. It wasn't a meeting scheduled in a dark alley, but a formal event at the very gala where Maya had once been humiliated, the same ballroom where red punch had stained her tattered apron. This time, the atmosphere was different. The air was charged with a heavy, electric silence as the heavy oak doors swung open. Maya stepped into the room, and the impact was immediate. She wasn't just wearing a designer gown. She was wearing her history like a suit of armor. The transformation was so total that for a few seconds, the room didn't recognize her. But as she moved toward the center of the hall with a calm, predatory grace, the realization began to ripple through the crowd like a shockwave. The orphan was gone. In her place stood the woman who now owned the very ground they were standing on. In the corner of the room stood the group that had once made her life a living hell. They were huddled together, clutching their expensive drinks, their faces pale as they looked at the woman they used to trip in the hallways. This was the moment of justice that Maya had dreamed of during her coldest nights at the orphanage. But as she approached them, her mental state wasn't one of petty rage or the desire for a public spectacle. She didn't need to scream to be heard. Her authority was quiet, rooted in a deep sense of dignity that they could never understand. When she finally stood before the girl who had been the ringleader of her torment, the silence was deafening. The girl's glass trembled in her hand, the ice clinking against the crystal, a rhythmic heartbeat of fear. This was the true face of the elite when the masks were stripped away. Fragile, insecure, and desperate. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because the way Maya chose to handle this confrontation revealed the hidden truth of her character. She didn't call for security to throw them out. She didn't make a scene. Instead, she looked them in the eye with a level of clarity that seemed to peel back their skin. She saw them for exactly what they were, products of a broken system, who relied on the misery of others to feel significant. Maya's decisions in that moment were governed by a mindset of absolute superiority, not the kind born of money, but the kind born of survival. She spoke in a low, steady voice, thanking them for the lessons they had taught her. She explained that their cruelty had been the very forge that sharpened her resolve, making her strong enough to reclaim her legacy. The impact of her words was far more devastating than any physical retaliation could have been. She was showing them that while they had tried to destroy her, they had actually been the architects of their own downfall. The bastidors of this confrontation were fascinating. Maya had already spent the morning reviewing the financial records of their family's companies. She knew which of their fathers were over-leveraged and which of their businesses were surviving only on the goodwill of the Valmont name. With a single signature, she could have erased their fortunes overnight. But she chose a different path. She offered them a choice, a chance to rectify their behavior or to face the cold reality of a world where she held the keys to their survival. This wasn't a journey of revenge. It was a journey of accountability. Maya was demonstrating that power, when wielded with dignity, is an unstoppable force. The people who once laughed at her hand-me-down clothes were now looking for any sign of mercy in her eyes. It was a complete reversal of the social hierarchy, a revelation of how quickly the world can turn when the truth is finally allowed to breathe. Her mentors had advised her to be ruthless, to show the world that the Valmont family was not to be trifled with. But Maya's transformation included a level of empathy that they lacked. She understood that by sinking to their level, she would lose the very thing that made her the rightful heir. Her journey had taught her that the greatest impact you can have on an enemy is to show them a version of yourself that is entirely unaffected by their past actions. She watched as the girl who had spilled the punch tried to offer a stuttering apology, a hollow attempt to save herself from the consequences of her own history. Maya simply nodded, a gesture of dismissal that carried more weight than 1,000 words. She was moving past them, leaving them behind in the shadows of their own making, while she stepped forward into a future they could never touch. The psychological impact on the witnesses in the ballroom was profound. They saw a woman who had every reason to be bitter, yet she moved with the poise of a seasoned diplomat. This was the moment Maya truly assumed her role. She wasn't just a girl who got rich. She was a leader who understood the bastidors of human emotion. Her decisions were no longer based on the pain of the past, but on the vision for the future. She realized that the people who bullied her were merely symptoms of a larger rot in high society, a rot she was now in a position to cure. This wasn't just about her individual justice. It was about shifting the culture of the entire empire she had inherited. Every word she spoke and every gesture she made was a brick, and the foundation of a new kind of legacy, one built on character rather than just capital. As the night wore on, the news of the confrontation began to spread beyond the ballroom. The story of the long-lost heiress who faced her tormentors with grace was becoming a legend. In its own right, it was a narrative of transformation that resonated with everyone who had ever felt like an outsider. Maya had turned her scars into a map for others to follow. She was no longer defined by what was done to her, but by how she chose to respond. The true victory wasn't the mansion or the bank accounts. It was the fact that she could look in the mirror and see a woman who had remained true to herself. Despite the pressure of a billion-dollar conspiracy, the bastidors of the Valmont estate were finally being filled with the light of integrity. And it started with Maya's refusal to become a villain in her own story. The confrontation ended as quietly as it began. Maya turned her back on the past, her silk train sweeping across the floor where she once worked as a servant. She walked toward the balcony, looking out over the city that she now influenced in ways she was only beginning to understand. The journey from the orphanage floor to this moment of absolute authority was complete. But as she stood in the cool night air, the heavy silence of the evening was broken by a familiar sound, the vibration of her phone. A message had arrived from an unknown number, containing a single photograph that made the blood in her veins turn to ice. It was a photo of the silver locket, but this time, it was lying on a desk she didn't recognize, next to a document with her father's signature. The mystery of her abandonment wasn't solved. It was merely entering a more dangerous phase. She realized that the people she had just faced were the small players, the distractions meant to keep her eyes off the real architects of her misery. The true villains were still in the shadows, watching her every move from the bastidors of the global stage. Her transition to power had made her a visible target, and the revelation of her identity had triggered a sequence of events she couldn't yet stop. Maya took a deep breath, her mindset shifting once again. The Cinderella phase was over. The battle for the soul of the Valmont Empire was moving into the realm of high-stakes corporate warfare. She wasn't just an heiress anymore. She was a sovereign, and she was ready for whatever came next. Comment below. I'm on this journey too. The flickering lights of the city below seemed like distant stars, reflecting off the glass of the balcony where Maya stood, yet her mind was miles away, anchored in the memory of a cold orphanage floor. It is in these moments of profound stillness that the true impact of such a journey reveals itself. You see, the bank accounts were full and the name on the door had changed. But the woman standing there was the same one who had once found strength in the silence of a library. This is the truth occulta that many people overlook when they see a story of sudden wealth. Money can change your scenery. It can buy you a seat at the table, and it can certainly settle a few scores. But it cannot create the spirit required to survive the climb. Maya realized that the silk against her skin felt luxurious, but it was the scars beneath it that gave her the authority to lead. Her transformation was never about the price tag of her gown. It was about the evolution of her mental state from one of endurance to one of purposeful impact. She had spent years believing she was nothing, only to discover that being nothing had actually made her everything. The resilience she had cultivated during her routine of struggle was the very foundation upon which her new empire was built. It was her secret weapon and the vast doors of high-stakes negotiations. While others in her position might have been blinded by the glitter of their new reality, Maya remained grounded by the weight of her past. She understood that her value didn't come from the Valmont name, but from the fact that she had survived without it. This realization is a powerful lesson in self-worth that resonates far beyond the sub-niche of drama or the specifics of a lost heiress. It is a universal human truth. Who you are in the dark defines who you will be in the light. Maya's decisions were no longer dictated by the fear of poverty, but by a deep sense of responsibility toward the girl she used to be. She became a guardian of her own essence, ensuring that the wealth didn't dilute the character that had been forged in the fire of adversity. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because there is a specific type of wisdom that only comes from having lived through both extremes of the human experience. Maya began to see that her life wasn't a tragedy followed by a miracle. It was a continuous journey of self-discovery. The long-lost heiress was a title, but the survivor was her identity. She realized that if she had been raised in the mansion, shielded from the world by bodyguards and tutors, she might have become just as hollow and entitled as the people she had recently faced. In the ballroom, her time in the shadows had given her a level of empathy and a sharp, investigative mind that no amount of elite training could provide. She saw the vast doors of the corporate world not as a game of greed, but as an opportunity for systemic change. This mental shift was her true coronation. She was no longer just an heir. She was a visionary who understood that the real currency of the world isn't gold, but the impact you leave on the souls of others. The revelations about her past continued to surface, but they no longer held the power to break her. Every new document and every uncovered secret was just another piece of data for her to process with her newfound mental fortitude. She looked at the silver locket, now repaired and resting on her dresser, and saw it not as a symbol of abandonment, but as a testament to her durability. It had stayed with her through the laundry rooms and the school hallways, a silent witness to her growth. Maya's story teaches us that your current circumstances are never a final verdict on your worth. The world may try to label you. It may try to exchange your identity for a lesser version. But the truth of who you are is written in a language that only you can truly translate. Her journey was a testament to the fact that when you own your story, the good, the bad, and the agonizing, you become untouchable. In her first major board meeting as the head of the Valmont Foundation, Maya didn't speak about profit margins or market share. She spoke about human potential. She looked at the room full of executives and shared a vision of a world where identity wasn't determined by birthright, but by the courage to face the truth. The impact of her speech was transformative. It stripped away the corporate jargon and forced everyone to look at the human cost of their decisions. She was utilizing her authority to bridge the gap between the mansion and the orphanage, using the vast doors of the legal system to create pathways for others who were still trapped in the shadows. This was her legacy in the making. She wasn't just reclaiming a fortune. She was reclaiming the soul of a family that had lost its way long before she was born. Her mental state was one of absolute clarity. She would be the leader, who remembered what it was like to be ignored. The connection she felt to her audience, even within the cold walls of a boardroom, was rooted in that shared human experience of wanting to be seen. She knew that her story was a mirror for millions of others who were fighting their own silent battles. Whether it's a career struggle, a personal loss, or a fight for recognition, the underlying theme is always the same: the search for our true self. Amidst the noise of the world's expectations, Maya had found hers not in the bank accounts, but in the reflection of her own eyes when she finally stopped apologizing for her existence. This was the ultimate victory over the villains of her past. They had taken her name, her parents, and her comfort, but they could never take her spirit. By the time she stepped back into her office that evening, the transition was complete. She was a woman who knew her value, and that knowledge made her the most powerful person in the room. As the moonlight bathed her office in silver, Maya picked up a pen to sign the first of many documents that would restructure the orphanage she grew up in, turning it into a center for excellence and innovation. She wasn't doing it out of a need for revenge or to show off her wealth. She was doing it because it was the right decision. She was acting from a place of abundance, not just of money, but of character. The journey that started with a broken locket had led her to a place of total alignment. Every struggle, every tear, and every moment of doubt had been a necessary step in her evolution. She stood at the window, watching the city pulse with life, and she felt a deep, resonant peace. The mystery of her origin was being solved piece by piece, but the mystery of her potential was just beginning to unfold. She was ready to face the world, not as a victim of a conspiracy, but as the master of her own fate, leaving an impact that would be felt long after the wealth was gone. The darkness of the night was no longer a place of fear for her. It was a place of reflection. She thought about the millions of lives that would be touched by the decisions she made in the coming years. The responsibility was immense, but her mindset was prepared. She had learned that the most important truth occult to the most important hidden truth is that the power to change your life resides entirely within your own perspective. You can choose to be a product of your past, or you can choose to use your past as the fuel for your future. Maya had made her choice. She was moving forward with a grace that silenced her critics and a strength that inspired her allies. The story of the long-lost heiress was reaching its peak, but the story of the woman who changed an empire was only on chapter 1. As she turned away from the window, a soft light caught the silver of her locket, and she smiled, knowing that the best parts of her journey were still ahead of her, hidden in the vast doors of tomorrow. Write down: this makes sense to me. The weight of the Valmont signet ring on Maya's finger felt heavier than usual as she stepped into the one room that had remained sealed since the night of the tragic accident. 18 years ago, her father's private study. The air inside was still, preserved in a bubble of mahogany and old parchment, as if time itself had refused to enter. This was the sanctum where the most pivotal decisions of the empire had been made, far from the prying eyes of the bored and the public bastidors. For weeks, Maya had been the face of a miraculous transformation, a symbol of justice and grace. But as she approached the heavy painting behind the desk, she felt a shift in her mental state. The intuition that had kept her alive in the orphanage was screaming that the journey was far from over. Behind a hidden latch, she found the cold steel of a private safe vault that even the most high-powered forensic accountants hadn't been able to locate. This was the final repository of her father's truth, a hidden truth that he had guarded with his life. As the heavy door creaked open, Maya didn't find stacks of gold or piles of cash. Instead, she found a single black ledger and a series of encrypted drives that seemed to pulsate with a dark energy. Her hands trembled as she opened the first page, and the impact of the words written in her father's frantic handwriting was like a physical blow to her chest. She realized that her father hadn't just been a billionaire. He was a man who had discovered a secret so dangerous it had turned his own circle against him. The accident that had claimed her parents' lives and sent her into the shadows wasn't just a move to steal a fortune. It was a desperate attempt to bury the revelations contained within this safe. Maya stared at the names listed in the ledger, names of people she currently shared boardrooms with, people who had smiled at her during the gala, and people who occupied the highest seats of government. Every decision they had made for 2 decades was revealed here as part of a much larger, more terrifying plan. Now I want to go even deeper into this matter, because the discovery in that vault changed the nature of Maya's mission, from one of reclamation to one of survival. She had thought that becoming the heiress was the finish line, the final victory over the bullies and the isolation of her past. But as she scanned the documents, she realized that her birthright wasn't a throne, it was a target. The real danger wasn't the imposter who had lived her life or the petty snobs who had mocked her. The real danger was a shadowy cabal that viewed the Valmont Empire as a mere tool for a much darker global impact. Her mental state shifted from a sense of peaceful justice to a sharp, tactical alertness. She understood that being the heir was just the beginning of a peril far greater than anything she had faced in the orphanage. She was now holding the evidence of a truth occulta that could topple the very foundations of the society she had just rejoined. The ledger detailed the bastidors of a conspiracy that spanned across continents, involving the systematic manipulation of resources and lies on a scale that was almost impossible to comprehend. Maya saw her own name mentioned in a section titled Contingency. She realized that her survival hadn't been a miracle or a mistake. It was a move on a chessboard she was only just beginning to understand. Someone had wanted her, kept alive but hidden, a piece to be used later in a game that was still being played. This revelation made her question every person she had trusted since her return. Was Arthur Vance truly her ally, or was he a guardian assigned to keep her in check? Was the estate security detail there to protect her, or to ensure she didn't dig too deep? The walls of the mansion, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like the bars of a very expensive cage. The psychological impact of this discovery was immense. Maya had spent so much energy transforming herself into the perfect leader, the dignified survivor who could face her enemies with a smile. But the ledger required a different kind of transformation. It required her to become a shadow herself, to navigate the world with a level of secrecy and cunning she hadn't yet mastered. She began to see the moment Cinderella as a clever distraction, a way for her enemies to watch her under the bright lights, while they continued their work in the dark. The journey had taken a sharp, lethal turn. She looked at the silver locket on the desk and realized it was more than a memento. It was a key to a code she still needed to break. Every clue she had followed to find her identity was actually leading her toward a confrontation that would determine the fate of millions, not just her own. As she delved deeper into the encrypted files, she found photographs taken from the bastidors of her own childhood, images of her in the orphanage, taken from a distance, documenting every year of her struggle. They had been watching her. The people who destroyed her family had been observing her from the very beginning, waiting for the perfect moment to bring her back into the light. This realization brought a new kind of fire to her eyes. She wasn't just a girl who had been found. She was a variable in a formula that she was now determined to break. The mindset of the orphan, the girl who knew how to hide in plain sight and read the subtle intentions of others, became her primary defense. She realized that her greatest power wasn't the billions of dollars in the Valmont accounts, but the fact that her enemies still underestimated her. They saw a girl playing queen, but they didn't see the strategist who had been sharpened by 18 years of invisibility. The final document in the safe was a letter addressed specifically to her, written by her father only days before the crash. In it, he didn't speak of love or legacy. He spoke of a choice. He warned her that if she ever found the safe, she would have to decide whether to walk away and live a life of quiet luxury, or to take up a mantle that would make her the most hunted woman in the world. He spoke of the impact her decisions would have on the future and the moral weight of the truth she now possessed. Maya sat in the silence of the study, the weight of that choice pressing down on her spirit. She thought of the life she could have, the travel, the comfort, the peace. Then she thought of the girl on the cold floor, the people who were currently being crushed by the same cabal that killed her parents, and the absolute necessity of justice. The transformation was final now. She wasn't just Maya, and she wasn't just a Valmont heiress. She was the one person who could stop a catastrophe that had been decades in the making. The journey from the shadows into the light had only revealed a deeper darkness, and Maya was the only one with the lamp. She closed the ledger and felt a cold, sharp resolve settle in her heart. The game was no longer about a lost inheritance. It was about the survival of the truth itself. As she heard footsteps approaching the study door, she didn't hide the documents. She stood tall, her eyes fixed on the door, ready to face whatever and whoever was on the other side. The cliffhanger of her life was about to resolve into a battle that would redefine what it meant to be powerful. She realized that the secrets held in that study were just the tip of the iceberg. The bastidors of her father's life were filled with revelations that would require every ounce of her mental fortitude to survive. The impact of what she was about to do would ripple through every sector of society, exposing truths that many would kill to keep hidden. Maya was no longer looking for a family. She was looking for an ending to a war that had started before she was born. The transition from a story of drama into a story of high-stakes intrigue was complete. She was standing on the edge of a precipice, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the fall. She was ready to fly. As the door to the study opens, a new chapter begins not just for Maya, but for all of us who have walked this path alongside her. Her journey from the shadows into the light reminds us that our true power isn't found in what we own, but in the courage it takes to face the truth, no matter how daunting it might be. If this story touched something deep within you, or if you've ever felt like you were fighting a battle that no one else could see, I'd love for you to stay a part of this community. By subscribing to the channel, you're making sure we can keep exploring these deep human truths and unfolding the mysteries that define our lives. It's been a privilege sharing these revelations with you today. If you're still here with me, it shows that you value the kind of depth and resilience we've discussed. And that connection is exactly why I do this. Go ahead and hit the like button if you felt that spark of justice along with Maya truly helps the message reach those who need to hear it most. And because I know you're one of the few who truly stayed for the whole journey, write down in the comments, "I'm with you until the end." Seeing that lets me know who is really part of this inner circle. The story doesn't stop here, though. There is another layer to this transformation and the decisions that follow, which we haven't even touched yet. There's a video right here on the side that complements everything we've talked about today, diving even deeper into the mindset required to handle these kinds of life-changing shifts. Click it and continue the journey with me over there.